Thank you, everyone, and thanks for that welcome, Kyle. Good afternoon, friends, colleagues. Nice to see you all and to see so many people I haven't seen for a long time. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, traditional custodians of the land where we're meeting today, paying my respects to the elders, both past and present of this land. And I'd also like to celebrate our young people, the next generation that will take up their family and cultural responsibilities and will be sitting up on this stage one day, so I'd like to acknowledge them. Over some time now, I've worked closely with the business sector, government and with our communities. My focus has always been to shift the socio-economic paradigm for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I want to see our people both grounded in culture and, as my brother here says, thriving. It's very important to me. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues from PwC's Indigenous Consulting who are here today, and also our partner colleagues from PricewaterhouseCoopers. I'd also like to take a moment to formally acknowledge what an amazing panel I'm sitting next to, and I feel absolutely privileged to share the stage with Chris and Megan. I'm sure that you as the audience would agree with me that their speeches were on point, accurately representing the current landscapes and pathway ahead for Indigenous affairs in this country. So let's hear it again for Megan and Chris. So I heard messages from both of you that emphasise the importance and need for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have a voice, to have agency and control over our lives, and to individually and collectively make our own decisions about the things that affect us, including in policy and legislative reform. Our nation has just this weekend had an election, as we all know. It would be safe to say that Australia's First Peoples relationships with past and successive governments sway with not only the 4-year parliamentary pendulum, but as you said, Megan, successive changes over many years with the governments that we've had. Australia's First Peoples now await with anticipation, in particular over the next 100 days of the Liberal coalition government, on how they will genuinely work in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in delivering on their commitments in Indigenous affairs. With that in mind, today's panel discussion provides us all here today with the opportunity to explore a deeper narrative and gain a better understanding from the panellists' perspectives on how Australia's First Peoples' unique rights are considered within Australia's national, political, social and economic agenda. So we're going to have 20 minutes of questions from the floor. Please raise your hand if you have a question. A microphone will be brought to you. If you could say your name and the organisation from which you represent, and ask the question to whoever you'd like to answer. As we have limited time, could I ask that you only ask one question at a time, please? I know you're all enjoying your dessert. I might start then while you're eating and get you into the mood. So I might just lead on to what you were talking about, Megan. Our people have long been calling for a treaty, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples recognises, as you said, rightly, that treaties, agreements and other arrangements and relationships strengthen partnerships between Indigenous peoples. It would be remiss of me if I did not mention the legacy of the late Bob Hawke, a visionary in many respects, no matter what side of politics you were from, a friend to Indigenous Australia, and had the ability to bring together a wide range of stakeholders across the country, policy reform, structural reform, things to which we enjoy today. And for a time supported a treaty-making process in the Barunga Statement, which is over 30 years ago when you think back. So my question is, do we have So I know you outlined the process forward, but do we have the political leadership in this country that could achieve a treaty-making process that really brought the country together to achieve, if we were to embark on it, this journey?
Yeah, so, I think so. I think, so if I just start with the sequencing of the Uluru reforms, there was a strong sense that there were just some more urgent matters, and one was like a actual constitutional recognition of the structural place of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the kind of democratic framework. And I would agree with this, that the work of treaty agreements or constructive arrangements, because we're not sure what they look like in Australia, is very lengthy. And I think that was the idea behind the notion of a Makarrata Commission. These are complex things to pursue. We live in a federal system, and not every community is at the level that they could even contemplate doing such a thing. And then some didn't. I mean, it's fair to reflect, some people didn't want one, but generally the consensus was, and I think we're talking about treaties here because I'm not sure what the appetite is for some pan agreement. I think the idea was to set up the framework in terms of the public law system, recognising, as it does in native title, a collective entity, and then commence that work that needs to be done on agreement making. But I mean, that, I think there will always be political leadership, but you've got to be strategic how you get there. Because just coming cold to the Australian polity, and although we know what a treaty is and we know our aspirations for change, but it doesn't necessarily mean the rest of Australia does.
Well, that's right, and I think people in this room today learnt a lot from your speech. I think it's a very complex matter, and I think a lot of people here heard things today that they didn't know. So thank you for that and the process that you've embarked on and your colleagues have embarked on. Chris, what about you? Do you think that there's strategic leadership, and maybe you can't answer that in your current position, you might just have to say yes?
Yes. No, look, I think, Georgina, if the political leadership is not here today, it's going to turn up at some stage, When I think about treaties call me romantic, but in leadership roles, one has to be romantic and articulate a sense of hope, because if all we can do is talk about what's not possible, then that doesn't really make us authentic leaders. And so I think it's inevitable. It's like same-sex marriage. It's like letting women vote. There'll be a time in which we think, what were we worried about? And yes, treaty conversations are complex, but there's a level at which they're not that complex, and I think that's the trick, is to get to that. And I think it is a conversation between government at various levels and local traditional owners about an agreement in which we recognise that historically we haven't quite got the relationship right from the get-go. So let's acknowledge that, and let's agree on how we're going to coexist on this land that we now share into the future. And let's have a conversation about what that actually means, because you're not going anywhere, we're not going anywhere, so let's just get some agreement about how we can coexist. And when we can think about it in those reasonably simple terms, it's not as scary. And so I think there is room for a gentle first step towards considering, what does a path to treaty look like? What does an agreement about how we coexist in the future, what does that look like? And it's important to understand that a treaty or an agreement is something that we negotiate. It's a negotiated document. And so if you're not ready to sign, or you're still grumpy about stuff, well, let's just keep talking until you're not afraid of it and you're not grumpy about it, and let's get to a point where we agree, because that's what a treaty is, and let's just sign off and let's get into this future that we want to get to.
Thanks, Chris. I think we've got a question over there. Simon Niche, I think, is it?
Thanks, Georgina. Simon Nish, Shell Australia. Both presenters, thank you very much. My question is for Professor Davis. You shared with us that the decision to share the Uluru Statement to the Australian polity, or the Australian non-Indigenous people, was very deliberate. And you also made some very strong comments about envisaging. By doing that, were you envisaging short-circuiting the political process in some way, or somehow stepping around or triggering some different way of engaging the political process that hadn't served you well to date?
I think it's more about that imagination point, maybe, because what I've found, I mean, I'm not an experienced political operator. I only came into this as a constitutional lawyer, but what I always found when we met with politicians is there's a lot of truths that they have that are really hard to disrupt. For example, you go to Canberra and everybody talks about what it takes to win a referendum, and we've had 8 successful referendums and out of 44, and so a colleague of mine wrote a book that said that those 8 were bipartisan. So it's hard science now in Canberra that they have to be bipartisan, but there's a lot of complexity around that, because if you look at them, 4 of those 8 were at the same ballot, and 2 of them didn't have bipartisan support, and so it's really hard, but you can't get past that first point with them. They will just not enter into a conversation that anything really is possible, and they're very scared of any referendum failing. The fear of failure in Canberra is huge on any matter, whether it's Section 44, 4-year terms, public, or all this. And so, I mean, I don't know how anything really happened at Uluru. It wasn't planned, and we were just slightly, because the politicians were coming up, but they wanted to leave to get back for champagne breakfast for the AFL round. There was an Indigenous round, and so we were a little bit maybe put out a bit. But we'd spoken about the fact that we need to be talking to our fellow Australians, like we live among Australians, and maybe by having those conversations, I think Chris touched upon this really well, by talking to people, and maybe we could get Australians to, as they did in 1967, which was often, people having cups of teas and talking about the exigency of reform. This weekend we're going to have a leaders' meeting, which was pre-planned before the election, in Cairns, on the Voice. And on the last day we're going out to Yarrabah, to the Tree of Knowledge, and there's a couple of old 67 campaigners still alive, one being Alfie Neal, who's like 95 and got an Order of Australia this year, and we wanted to go there for the 2nd anniversary to pay tribute to those 67 campaigners and the work that they did, but they'll often say a lot of it was just relationships and conversations and cups of tea. So, yeah, it wasn't a strategy, but we just felt like we've been at this for a long time. You mentioned Hawke, commitment to treaty, commitment to land rights. So much falls over, national land rights. A lot falls over when you're just reliant on conventional law reform processes and you're just reliant on conventional political. So we want politicians to come on board, but we know that Australians changed the Constitution. That's how the Constitution is set up. And so we thought, well, let's build a people's movement, and that's why it was issued to the Australian people. I don't know if that answers your question, because there wasn't any exact science behind it, but yeah, we kind of thought if we could get Aussies to help, then maybe they would open their minds a bit to what we think is an important reform.
Question up the back there.
Hi there. Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. My name's Nina Hall. I'm from the University of Queensland School of Public Health. My question's for Dr. Sarah. I really loved reading your book several years ago, and I think what I found so powerful was its focus on strengths-based and really celebrating successful stories that really change what we think is possible. And so I think my question's kind of simple, and it's about the name of your department is about partnerships. And I was just wondering, can you give us some examples of effective partnerships, and also why were they successful? What are the features of effective partnerships?
Available in all good bookstores. No, I think that's not true, actually. You might have to go to Amazon, but...
Yeah. It's in the dollar bin, isn't it?
I don't know. What?
It's actually free on the
That's not nice.
I had to get one. I get one on everyone.
Coming at it, I swore I'd never become a bureaucrat again some time ago, and yet here I am sitting as a very senior bureaucrat. And I've got to tell you, I really love the job. I see my colleague out there, Rob. I love the job and what we can do with it. And I am very much committed to putting the partnerships aspect back into what we do as a department. So when you look at how governments structure their business, Megan commented earlier about everything being pulled into one place. And the challenge for me has been to give our department a sense of focus and a clear sense of purpose. And I think we've been able to do that. And so we've kind of pushed back from doing service delivery because otherwise this is a trick that we kind of, all governments of all persuasions fall into, where these kind of ghettoise Aboriginal service delivery. And so when I've come on board, I said, we've got to stop doing this. So if there's Aboriginal education stuff to be done, let's let the education department do that. If there's Aboriginal health stuff to do, let's let the health department do that. If there's Aboriginal justice stuff, then the justice department has to do that. And the role that we will play is brokering high quality relationships. Remember I said earlier that the essence of our success was through high expectations relationships, and so I see our role as less focus on service delivery, but more focus on enabling my colleagues across other parts of government to be able to engage in high quality relationships. And so that means working with communities to set them up for more sophisticated relationships. Now, naturally, that's going to come with all of its challenges, because there's a whole bunch of people who are stuck in a way of doing business that's kind of, as far as they're concerned, works, but there's a lot of data that says it hasn't actually worked as well as it should. And there's a lot of community out there who are stuck in a circumstance where they're used to working in a way that has just existed. And so it's going to be interesting to see how when we flip it from this arrangement to this arrangement, how all of us cope, because the most confronting thing in that circumstance is that there's nowhere to hide, and there's nobody to blame in that situation, because if we're co-creating solutions together, then we as Aboriginal community and we as government and government departments, we're both held to account in that circumstance. So we can't sit up here as the political and corporate masters and blame community, and community can't wallow in victim status and just keep blaming government, because that's not going to work anymore in a partnership that's honourable.
Kyle's standing up, so I think that means the questions are over. Is that correct? We've run out of time today for questions. In closing, I'd like to, he's making me laugh. Could I please hear it for Dr. Chris Sarra and Professor Megan Davis?